Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to meticulously unpack the events of April 25th and 26th, 1986. We'll be using a chronological breakdown of exactly what unfolded that night to truly understand the anatomy of a catastrophe and, what it really teaches us about the dangers of institutional silence and systemic failure today. Right off the bat, we have to ask the central mystery of that night. How did a routine test, a test literally designed to improve plant safety, trigger the absolute worst nuclear disaster in history? It's just a staggering piece of dramatic irony. To really understand how this happened, we need to go back in time a bit to Soviet Ukraine. Which brings us to our first section, the pride of Soviet Ukraine. And that leads us straight into understanding the actual anatomy of reactor number 4. Okay, let's dive into this. To grasp what went wrong, you really have to appreciate the immense scale of this facility. The Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant was basically the crown jewel of Soviet engineering. It provided massive amounts of electricity to a rapidly growing industrial region. And to understand how it worked, we can break it down to its core components. First, atoms split in a process called fission, generating an incredible amount of heat inside the reactor core. Second, that extreme heat is used to boil water. Third, the boiling water creates high-pressure steam that is then funneled to turn massive turbines. And finally, those spinning turbines produce electricity. So when you strip away the complexities, a nuclear reactor is essentially a highly complex, incredibly dangerous way to boil water. But here's the thing. Chernobyl didn't just use your standard run-of-the-mill reactor. It utilized the RBMK reactor. This was a very specific, unique Soviet design. It was massive. It was incredibly powerful, and crucially, it was capable of being refueled while it was still running. That was a major operational advantage for producing continuous electricity. And this brilliantly illustrates a fatal dichotomy in the engineering. On one side, it had robust safety characteristics, right? Massive water cooling pumps and control rods that were meant to absorb radiation and safely slow the nuclear reaction down. But on the flip side, it possessed inherent fatal weaknesses. Without getting too bogged down in the weeds of nuclear physics, the RBMK was designed in a way that made it highly unstable when operating at low power levels. It was a known quirk of the design, something operators were just supposed to carefully manage. So that sets the stage for our next part, the fateful safety test. To make sense of this test, we have to look at the human element. The engineers on duty, the operators, the control room staff, these were trained professionals. They were trying to answer one critical question. If there was a sudden loss of external electricity, could the reactor's dying momentum keep the cooling water pumps running just long enough for backup generators to kick in? On the night of April 25th, they were simply carrying out what they honestly believed was a routine procedure to test this vital failsafe. They were just following orders and relying on technology they had been trained to trust entirely. But, well, the plan quickly unraveled. During the day on April 25th, the local power grid actually requested a delay in the test to meet civilian electricity needs. So the reactor just sat there at partial power for hours, and this allowed a radioactive byproduct called xenon to build up inside the core. By the evening, conditions inside the reactor were seriously deteriorating. By the time the early hours of April 26 rolled around and they were finally cleared to begin, they were working with a deeply poisoned, sluggish, and wildly unpredictable reactor. Now, what's really interesting to see here is how the reactor's stability shifted drastically. Because of those delays and that heavy xenon buildup, the operators had to pull out almost all of the safety control rods just to keep the nuclear reaction from dying out completely. The stability went from normal to unstable to highly unstable. They were effectively balancing a massive, incredibly delicate machine on a knife's edge, totally blind to just how precarious the situation had actually become. Which brings us to the most critical moment, the point of no return. The tension in that control room must have been absolutely palpable. As they initiated the test, reducing the water flow to see if the pumps would hold up, the water inside the reactor began to boil far too rapidly. More steam meant less water to absorb the nuclear reaction, causing the core's power to suddenly start rising. It was a devastating feedback loop. Desperate to stop the rising power, an operator hit the emergency shutdown button, sending all those withdrawn control rods rushing back into the core at once. But because of a fatal flaw in the RBMK's design, the very tips of these rods were made of graphite, and graphite is a material that actually accelerated the reaction for a split second before stopping it. That split second was all it took. The reactor suffered a catastrophic power surge, spiking to hundreds of times its normal safe capacity. The immense heat instantly flashed the remaining cooling water into steam, creating unbearable pressure. The resulting steam explosion completely blew the 1,000-ton biological shield right off the top of the reactor. This was immediately followed by a second, even more powerful explosion that totally shattered the reactor core, exposing the burning nuclear material directly to the open night air. Inside the control room, there was immediate, blinding confusion. The shockwave literally blew in the heavy doors and filled the room with thick dust. And there was an intense information asymmetry happening here. The dials and gauges were either broken or giving impossible off-the-charts readings. The staff initially couldn't even comprehend the true scale of what had just happened. They genuinely believed the reactor core was still intact and that this was a terrible but ultimately manageable system failure. And that tragic misunderstanding leads us to battling an invisible enemy. This profound denial set a horrific stage for the first responders. The firefighters who arrived first at the scene looked up at the flames on the roof and believed they were fighting exactly that, just a conventional industrial fire. They were completely unequipped and utterly unaware that the rubble they were stepping on, the smoke they were inhaling, and the very air around them was completely saturated with lethal radiation from an exposed core. So the crucial point is that they were walking into a highly dangerous environment, dictated by an enemy they simply could not perceive. Radiation is invisible. It is completely odorless. You can't feel it damaging your body's cells. These incredibly brave men poured water onto an exposed nuclear reactor, entirely blind to the invisible force that was sealing their fate.
Meanwhile, just down the road, we have a city left behind.
While this desperate, tragic battle raged at the plant, just a few kilometers away lay the city of Pripyat. This was a vibrant, young city home to nearly 50,000 people, mostly plant workers and their families. Astonishingly, despite an exposed nuclear core spewing radioactive isotopes directly into the atmosphere, the evacuation did not happen immediately. The morning of April 26th arrived, and the residents of Pripyat just went about their normal weekend routines. Children played outside in the sandboxes. People walked the streets completely and totally oblivious to the toxic ash that was gently falling all around them. Let's move on and see how this builds, because this response reveals a truly horrifying picture of systemic denial. At Reactor 4, the threat level was catastrophic, while over in Pripyat, radiation was rising rapidly. Yet officially, there was zero warning for civilians. Life just continued. The authorities, paralyzed by a mixture of disbelief, rigid protocol, and an overwhelming fear of causing panic, kept the truth entirely hidden, while an invisible cloud blanketed a whole city. It's a chilling reminder for us today of exactly why robust safety cultures and institutional transparency are absolutely non-negotiable when dealing with high-stakes technology. Which leaves us with a really haunting question. With an invisible, lethal threat spreading by the hour, how long could the truth realistically be hidden? Not just from the people of Pripyat, but from the wider Soviet Union and the rest of the entire world. The true scale of this catastrophe was only just starting to materialize, and the initial cover-up was about to violently collide with cold, hard reality. But that is a story we will continue in our next Explainer. Thanks for joining me today. Welcome back to the Explainer. Okay, let's dive right into this. Today, we're picking up exactly where we left off, jumping straight into the second half of our deep dive into the Chernobyl disaster. We're moving from those immediate, devastating moments of the blast into the massive fallout, the frankly unbelievable cleanup efforts, and the profound, lasting legacy of the whole thing. So as you probably remember from part 1, the explosion at reactor number 4 left the epicenter in just absolute ruins. Literally in an instant, a routine safety test transformed into a catastrophic explosion that blew the massive roof right off the reactor. It just exposed the burning radioactive core to the open air. And well, this is the exact moment our story shifts, right? It goes from a localized industrial accident to a rapidly unfolding global crisis. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll be tracing the disaster outward like a ripple effect. We'll hit 1. The secret spreads. 2. The evacuation and the liquidators. 3. Containing reactor number 4. 4. The human and environmental cost. 5. Why it actually happened. And 6. The global nuclear legacy. All right, section 1. The secret spreads. Silence from the Soviet Union. You know, in those critical hours and days right after the explosion, there was this massive, dangerous disconnect. On one hand, you had the internal response from the Soviets, which was basically initial secrecy, outright denial, totally restricting information, and this tragic delay in communicating even to their own citizens living right next door. But on the other hand, you had the expanding external reality.
There's this invisible, highly radioactive cloud quietly rising from the exposed reactor core and spreading way beyond the immediate area, carrying some really severe consequences on the wind. It's honestly a chilling reminder of what happens when PR is prioritized over public safety.
Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds over those first few days. On day 1, following the explosion, officials strictly denied the severity of the situation. It actually wasn't until day 2 that the delayed evacuation of the nearby city of Pripyat finally began, abruptly moving tens of thousands of people from their homes. Forever. But by day 3, the secret just couldn't be contained by borders anymore. Elevated radiation levels were suddenly detected at a nuclear power plant in Sweden, which is over 1,000 kilometers away. The Swedish workers actually realized the radiation was blowing in from the east. So it was this undeniable international discovery that ultimately forced the Soviets days later to publicly admit to the world that, yes, a disaster had occurred. Which brings us to Section 2, evacuation and the liquidators, the massive human response.
Hundreds of thousands. Just think about that number for a second. That is the staggering scale of human beings thrown into the breach over the coming months and years to mitigate a disaster of totally unprecedented proportions. So the crucial point here is the sheer magnitude of their sacrifice. These individuals were known as the liquidators. We're talking about incredibly brave firefighters, soldiers, miners, and civilian engineers who carried out the massive, highly dangerous cleanup and containment ops right in the immediate aftermath. They were clearing highly radioactive debris off the roof, pumping contaminated water out of flooded basements, and just working tirelessly to extinguish the remaining fires. They effectively acted as a human shield. I mean, they put themselves in immense danger to stop the spread of radiation and protect the rest of the continent. Their historical contribution is absolutely monumental.
Moving right along to Section 3, containing Reactor Number 4, sealing the beast. Okay, so to stop the continued spewing of radioactive material, engineers basically had to devise a massive containment strategy on the fly. Step 1 was the construction of the original emergency sarcophagus. This was built super hastily in 1986 under extreme radiation conditions. It was this gigantic steel and concrete structure meant to temporarily entomb the reactor. But, it was never designed to last forever. Fast forward a few decades, and it began heavily deteriorating. So that necessitated Step 2, building the new Safe Confinement. This thing is a colossal, state-of-the-art metal arch. They carefully slid it over the old sarcophagus in 2016 to permanently and safely enclose that decaying original structure and, of course, the reactor inside it. And today, well, the long-term geographical impact is still staggering. The Chernobyl Exclusion Zone remains firmly in place. It's a massive, roughly 1,000 square mile area around the plant, which is just an incredible amount of land. It's a strictly controlled, permanently altered landscape. And while nature has surprisingly reclaimed much of those abandoned cities and forests, the area remains largely uninhabitable for humans. It stands as a very real, very silent monument to the disaster. Let's turn to Section 4, human and environmental cost, the fallout and the facts. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it separates historical reality from Hollywood myth. When we look at the fallout, we really have to stick to the facts. On the confirmed historical evidence side, we have the tragic, permanent displacement of hundreds of thousands of local residents who were literally never allowed to return home. We have undeniable long-term environmental contamination of the local soil and water, and we've got documented evidence-based health impacts, like a tragic rise in thyroid cancer among folks who were exposed to the radiation as children. But on the flip side, we have the unsupported claims and myths. The sensationalized physical mutations, those extreme apocalyptic health claims, and the heavily fictionalized graphic events created mostly for entertainment. When we look back at history, it is absolutely crucial that we ground our understanding in the confirmed, documented evidence. Moving into Section 5, why did it happen? Anatomy of a disaster? It's human nature to look for a simple scapegoat, isn't it? Which naturally leads to this crucial question. Was Chernobyl caused by a single mistake? Like, was it just one bad operator pressing the wrong button? The answer, unequivocally, is no. Disasters of this immense magnitude are absolutely never just one error. Instead, investigators point to what we call a Swiss cheese model of cascading failures. It's like a giant puzzle where all the wrong pieces fit together. First, there were severe, inherent reactor design flaws in the RBMK reactors used by the Soviets, flaws that the operators themselves weren't even fully aware of. Second, there were critical human decisions and operational mistakes made during that fateful safety test, where vital safety systems were actually disabled. Third, there was a systemic lack of a safety culture at the plant. And finally, overarching all of this was a culture of governmental secrecy and denial that constantly prioritized production and state image way above safety. Basically, these four elements tragically aligned to create the explosion.
And this brings us to our final section, Section 6, the Global Nuclear Legacy, Changing the World.
You see, the shockwaves of Chernobyl went far beyond just radiation. They completely shook the foundations of the global nuclear industry. It fundamentally transformed global discussions on nuclear safety and pushed international bodies to totally overhaul their regulations. It mandated far better, much more immediate emergency communication protocols between nations. And most importantly, it highlighted the absolute, undeniable necessity of transparency. It enforced strict accountability and rigorous peer review in nuclear operations worldwide. These international, systemic changes, that is the true legacy of the disaster. As we reach the end of this explainer, the ultimate lesson of Chernobyl becomes crystal clear. Transparency and accountability are simply non-negotiable in the nuclear age. When you are dealing with forces this incredibly powerful, secrets and the suppression of the truth, they don't protect a nation, they endanger the entire world. So I want to leave you with this final thought. Chernobyl remains a lasting reminder of the consequences of ignoring warnings and hiding critical information. It forces us to ask a tough question. In our modern era of rapid technological advancement, are our systems truly fail-proof, or are we just creating new layers of Swiss cheese? Let that sink in. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Be sure to subscribe for more structured history documentaries, and until next time, keep learning.